There is a particular kind of person that an avoidant never fully prepares for. They have encountered neediness and managed it. They have encountered love and deactivated against it. They have moved through relationship after relationship with the same fundamental architecture intact. The distance maintained, the vulnerability rationed, the retreat executed cleanly whenever the closeness reached the threshold that their nervous system refused to cross. They developed, over years of this pattern, a kind of quiet confidence in their own imperviousness. Not arrogance, exactly. More like the settled assurance of someone who has tested the walls and found them reliable. And then the super empath walked in, and nothing in the avoidance relational history had equipped them for what that actually meant. Not because the super empath pursued harder, not because they loved louder or demanded more or refused to accept the distance in ways that other partners had eventually accepted it, but because the super empath did something that no amount of avoidant architecture had ever had to contend with before. They saw through the walls without attacking them. They understood the fear without weaponizing the understanding. They held space for the avoidance defended places without requiring those places to open on any timeline other than the avoidance zone. And in doing so, in being so precisely, almost unnervingly attuned, they became the most dangerous thing an avoidant can encounter. They became the person the avoidant actually felt safe with. Safety, for an avoidant, is not a comfortable experience. This needs to be understood clearly because it runs counter to everything that the word safety implies. For most people, safety in a relationship is the precondition for relaxation, for openness, for the gradual deepening of trust that allows love to become genuinely sustaining. Safety means the nervous system can settle, can stop scanning for threat, can allow the self to be present without the constant background calculation of how much to show and what to keep hidden. For the avoidant, safety produces the opposite of relaxation, because safety means the defenses are no longer necessary, and defenses that are no longer necessary are defenses that might come down. And defenses coming down means exposure, real exposure, the kind that isn't managed or rationed or offered in controlled doses at safe distances, the kind that simply is, unmediated, unprotected, nakedly present in the way that only genuine felt safety can produce. That exposure is the thing the avoidant has been engineering their entire relational life to prevent, not consciously, not with malice, but with the entire weight of a nervous system that learned, early and thoroughly, that exposure leads to pain. So when the super empath creates the conditions for genuine safety, when their attunement is so precise and their presence so non-threatening that the avoidance defenses actually begin to lower, the avoidant doesn't experience it as comfort. They experience it as terror, wearing the clothes of something beautiful. The super empath is not a type in the reductive sense that pop psychology sometimes makes of it. They are not a category defined by martyrdom or by an excessive tolerance for mistreatment. They are something more specific and more psychologically substantive than that. They are a person whose emotional intelligence operates at a depth that most people never reach, not because they were born different, but because their own history required them to develop extraordinary sensitivity as a survival skill. They learned to read rooms, to feel the emotional temperature of a space before they entered it fully, to understand what was unspoken in a person's behavior with an accuracy that could seem almost prescient. They developed the capacity to hold another person's pain without being destroyed by it, to extend empathy, not as a performance, but as a genuine neurological orientation toward the interior life of the people they loved. They became, through their own particular kind of difficult becoming, someone who could love the defended places in another person without needing those places to immediately transform. For the avoidant, encountering this was like being seen by someone who wasn't supposed to be able to see. All the careful staging, the managed presentation, the strategic distance, the practiced performance of not needing, the super empath looked at all of it with quiet, unhurried comprehension and loved what was underneath it anyway. Not despite the defenses, not in spite of the fear, but with a clear-eyed recognition of the fear as the thing that needed to be loved most. What happens inside the avoidant during the period of the relationship with the super empath is unlike anything they have experienced before, and the uniqueness of it is precisely what makes the aftermath so catastrophic. For the first time, the deactivating strategies struggle to gain traction. The fault-finding mechanism searches for material and comes up largely empty, because the super empath's attunement means they are rarely doing anything that genuinely warrants the level of criticism the mechanism needs to generate. The elevation of alternatives fails to produce its usual compelling imagery, because the alternative to someone who sees and accepts your defended places with compassion is, on honest examination, significantly less appealing than it used to be. The retrospective revision of the relationship's warmth cannot easily be executed, because the warmth is so consistent, so genuine, so specifically attuned to what the avoidant actually needs rather than what they perform needing, that manufacturing a flattened memory of it requires more distortion than the system can credibly sustain. The machinery keeps running, but it runs without the usual purchase, and the avoidant, for perhaps the first time in their relational life, finds themselves staying, not because they conquered the fear, but because the super empath made the staying feel, if not entirely safe, at least survivable, at least worth the cost of the exposure it required. This is where the avoidant begins, gradually and with enormous ambivalence, to actually arrive in the relationship. Not fully, the architecture doesn't permit full arrival, not without the kind of sustained therapeutic work that dismantles the structure rather than simply working around it, but partially, in moments, in the specific unglamorous, quietly extraordinary moments that the super impact creates through their particular quality of presence. Moments where the avoidant says something true about themselves that they have never said to anyone, where they allow themselves to be held emotionally without immediately constructing an exit, where the feeling that has always been there but always been pressed down rises far enough to be felt, if not yet fully named. The super empath receives all of this without making it a transaction, without storing it as leverage, without using the vulnerability that has been offered as a means of extracting more vulnerability than the avoidant is ready to offer. And that non-transactional quality, that genuine, unconditional receipt of whatever the avoidant was capable of giving in any given moment, is the thing that does the most damage to the wall. Not because it attacks the wall, but because it removes the wall's justification. The wall was built to protect against the pain that exposure brings. In the presence of the super empath, exposure keeps not bringing pain, and a defense mechanism that is repeatedly, consistently, experientially demonstrated to be unnecessary begins slowly, uncertainly, with frequent retreats, to be unnecessary in fact. And then the super empath leaves. Not necessarily in the dramatic sense of a sudden rupture, though it can be that. Sometimes the leaving is the quiet arrival at the end of a patience that was genuinely extraordinary, but was not, in the end, infinite. The super empath, for all of their emotional intelligence and all of their capacity to hold the avoidance defended places with compassion, is also a person with needs, with a self that requires reciprocity to remain whole, with a threshold lower than many people's, but real nonetheless, beyond which the loving of someone who keeps fighting their own love becomes more costly than any amount of genuine connection can compensate for. When the super impact reaches that threshold and acts on it, when they leave not from anger or from dramatic rupture, but from the quiet, devastating clarity that they have given what they have to give, and it isn't being met in the way they need it to be met, something happens in the avoidant that is categorically different from anything that has happened in their previous relationship endings. Because this time they knew it was real. This time there is no story available about the relationship being insufficient, or the other person being too demanding, or the connection being less than it appeared. The super empath's attunement means that the avoidant experience within the relationship more genuine understanding than they have ever been offered, more patient, more clear-eyed, more specifically attuned love than the deactivating strategies could entirely revise away. The evidence of its realness is not just felt, it is extensive. It is accumulated across the full duration of the relationship, In moments that the avoidance memory cannot flatten without an act of distortion so obvious that even the avoidance own suppression machinery balks at it. The first thing that breaks in the immediate aftermath of the super empath's leaving is the avoidance narrative competence, by which is meant their ability to construct and maintain the story that makes the ending feel acceptable. The story that has served them through every previous ending. This wasn't right, the timing was wrong, they needed too much, the connection was overestimated. Refuses to cohere this time, because every element of that story requires a misrepresentation of what actually happened that is too large to sustain against the weight of what the avoidant actually experienced. The super empath didn't need too much. They needed exactly what any person in a genuine relationship deserves: presence, reciprocity, the willingness of their partner to stay rather than flee every time the intimacy reached real depth. The timing wasn't wrong in any sense that is separable from the avoidant's own choices. The connection was not overestimated. If anything, the avoidant knows with uncomfortable precision that it was underutilized, that what was available between them was more than what they allowed themselves to receive, that the super empath was offering something the avoidant kept partially refusing, and the refusal was not the super empath's limitation, but their own. The narrative breaks because the facts don't support it, and without the narrative, the avoidant is left standing in the full, unmediated experience of what they have lost, without the buffering story, without the comfortable reframe, without anything between them and the truth of it except the suddenly insufficient machinery of suppression, trying and failing to process a loss that is too significant and too clearly self-caused to be filed away without remainder. What the avoidant feels in that unmediated space, if they allow themselves to feel it, rather than immediately reaching for the nearest available distraction, is something that most of their life has been organized around never feeling. It is the feeling of having been fully seen and fully loved and having been unable in the end to fully receive it, of having been offered the thing they needed most and having watched their own fear turn it away on their behalf, of being, for perhaps the first time, with genuine clarity, the author of their own loss in a way that cannot be attributed to circumstance or incompatibility or the insufficiency of the other person. This is not ordinary grief. Ordinary grief grieves a loss. This grieves a loss and simultaneously grieves the self that produced the loss. It is grief and self-confrontation running simultaneously, each amplifying the other, in a space that the avoidance psychological infrastructure was specifically not built to hold. And that, the simultaneous undefended encounter with both the magnitude of what was lost and the recognition of their own role in losing it, is what breaks them. Not immediately, not cleanly, not in a way that is visible from the outside in the early stages, but fundamentally, at the level of the story they have been telling about themselves and about what they are capable of and about what relationships are for and about whether the distance was ever actually protecting them from anything worth being protected from. The breaking is not destruction. This distinction matters enormously, and it will be returned to in the second part. The breaking is not the end of the avoidance capacity for anything. It is, in the most precise sense of the word, a fracture in a structure that needed to fracture in order for something different to become possible. The wall that the super empath's presence had begun to render unnecessary is now, in the super empath's absence, revealed as the thing that cost them the most significant connection of their relational life. That revelation is unbearable in the short term. It is also, potentially, the most important thing that has ever happened to them, because the avoidant, who has genuinely been broken by the loss of the super empath, is the avoidant who is, for the first time, in the presence of sufficient motivation to actually do the thing they have been avoiding doing, not just managing the pattern, not just recognizing it abstractly, but going into the interior, into the original wound, the original learned conviction that closeness leads to pain, and beginning, with whatever support they can find, the work of revision. Whether they take that step is the question that the second part addresses. What matters for the close of this first part is the recognition of what the breaking actually is. It is not punishment, It is not karma in any tidy moral sense. It is the natural consequence of a specific kind of loss, the loss of someone who saw you clearly, loved what they saw, and eventually had no choice but to stop waiting for you to see it too, landing in a psychological system that was finally, after a lifetime of successful avoidance, unable to avoid the full weight of what it had cost them. The super empath left, and in leaving, they did something that all the pursuing and all the patience and all the loving from inside the relationship could not do. They made the cost of the avoidance pattern undeniable. They made the wall visible by walking through the door it had always been protecting. And the avoidant, standing in the space that the super empath's leaving revealed, is finally, uncomfortably, productively alone with the truth of what the wall was always actually keeping out. Not danger, not pain, not the overwhelming annihilation of self that the nervous system had always promised exposure would produce. Just love, real, clear-eyed, patient, specifically attuned love, the kind that was always what they needed most, the kind they spent their whole relational life engineering themselves away from, the kind that just walked out the door, and for the first time, they are not relieved. They are broken open, and what comes through the opening in the second part is where the real story begins. Being broken open is not the same as being healed. This needs to be the first thing said here, because the temptation for the avoidant in the rawness of the aftermath, and for anyone watching from the outside, is to conflate the cracking with the transformation, to see the fracture in the wall and assume that what follows is automatically growth, automatically change, automatically the beginning of the person the avoidant was always capable of being, but kept choosing, consciously or not, to remain just short of. It isn't automatic. Nothing about what happens after the super empath leaves is automatic. What is automatic is the breaking. The loss does that without requiring any participation from the avoidant's conscious self. The super empath's departure, carrying with it the full weight of everything that was real and everything that was refused, lands in the avoidance system with a force that bypasses the suppression machinery entirely. Not because the machinery isn't trying, but because the loss is too specifically, too undeniably self-caused for the machinery to process it the way it has processed every previous loss. The story won't hold. The reframe won't stick. The relief that usually follows the ending of a relationship that the deactivating strategies have been dismantling for months, that relief doesn't come. What comes instead is the particular, unprecedented silence of a person who has run out of ways to explain themselves to themselves. In that silence, the avoidant encounters something they have been outrunning for most of their adult life. Not the super empath's absence specifically, though that is present and acute and more painful than they have language for yet. What they encounter is themselves, the actual self, not the managed presentation of it, the self that wanted and feared simultaneously, the self that felt the super empath's attunement land somewhere deep and true and then watched its own fear respond to that landing. By beginning, incrementally, to construct the distance that eventually made staying impossible for the person trying to love it. This encounter with the actual self is not in the first instance a gentle experience. It has the quality of an ambush, because the avoidant has been successfully avoiding this encounter for years, sometimes decades, and the psychological energy that was being expended on the avoidance has been so continuous and so total that most avoidants don't even know the encounter was being avoided. They experience the distance as preference, the independence as identity, the management of closeness as simply who they were rather than what they were doing to protect something that had never been allowed to fully form. Now, in the silence the super empath left behind, the distinction between who they are and what they have been doing collapses. And what is revealed underneath is not the monster that shame sometimes threatens to find there. It is something far more ordinary and far more devastating. It is a person who needed connection as much as anyone ever has, who learned to survive without it, and who just lost the one person who had come closest to making it feel possible again. The stages that follow this initial encounter don't move in a clean sequence. They overlap, recurse, contradict each other, but they have identifiable qualities that are worth mapping. because the avoidant moving through them rarely has the internal language to understand what is happening. And the absence of that language is itself one of the things that makes the process so prolonged and so painful. The first quality is hyper-awareness of absence. The avoidant who spent the relationship managing the super-empath's presence, calibrating how much closeness to allow, how much warmth to return, how much of themselves to offer, and how much to withhold, suddenly finds themselves in a world from which that presence has been completely removed. And the removal is total in a way that is neurologically shocking, because the super empath's attunement meant they were genuinely, specifically present in the avoidant's life, not as a background figure, but as someone whose quality of attention and understanding was woven into the daily texture of experience in ways the avoidant never fully registered while it was happening. Now every unregistered thread makes itself known by its absence, the specific quality of being understood without having to explain, the particular experience of being in a difficult internal state and having someone nearby who felt it without being told, the texture of a presence so attuned that it functioned almost as an extension of the avoidant's own awareness, offering back to them a reflection of their interior life that was more complete and more compassionate than the one they carried alone. All of it gone, and the absence is not generic, it is precise. It has the exact shape of what was there, which means it is felt not as a general loneliness, but as the specific loss of a specific quality of presence, that the avoidant has no framework for finding elsewhere, because they have never encountered it elsewhere. The super empath was not one among many people capable of this quality of attunement. For this avoidant, in this life, the super empath was likely the singular encounter with it, and the nervous system, which registered the significance even while the conscious self was managing it downward, knows this with a certainty that no amount of rationalizing can fully quiet. The second quality is the failure of substitution. Every previous significant loss in the avoidance relational history was eventually metabolized, however incompletely, however much residue remained, through some combination of new activity, new connection, the forward momentum of a life that kept presenting new things to engage with. The avoidant is genuinely good at forward momentum. It is, in many ways, the primary tool in their emotional management kit. Stay moving, stay engaged, stay sufficiently occupied that the interior quiet in which difficult feelings live never gets long enough to become threatening. After the super empath leaves, this tool fails in a way it has never failed before, not because the avoidant stops trying to use it. They do try, often desperately, with a compulsive investment in busyness and new engagement that is itself a signal of how badly the system needs the distraction to work. But the substitution doesn't take. New activity doesn't fill the specific space. New connection, when attempted, produces in the avoidant a constant, low-level awareness of the difference between what is being offered and what was lost, a comparison that runs automatically and cannot be switched off, and that makes everything new feel slightly hollow against the specific solidity of what the super empath represented. This hollowness is new information for the avoidant, even when they don't initially recognize it as information. It is the nervous system communicating, through the failure of its own usual coping strategies, that what was lost was not substitutable, was not one instance of a type, but a specific, irreplaceable reality. And that irreplaceability, which the super empath probably knew and probably tried to communicate, and which the avoidance deactivating strategies probably minimized while the relationship was active, is now experientially undeniable in a way that the mind cannot revise away. The third quality, and this is the one that tends to arrive later, after the acute phase of hyper-awareness and substitution failure has run its initial course, is retrospective clarity, a slow, unwilling, deeply uncomfortable revision of how the avoidant understands the entire arc of what happened between them. This revision runs counter to everything the deactivating strategies were designed to produce. Where those strategies generated fault-finding and retrospective flattening of the relationship's warmth, the retrospective clarity that arrives after the super empath's loss moves in the opposite direction. The memories that the deactivating strategies tried to flatten refuse to stay flat. They rise with a vividness and a specificity that is almost physical. Moments of genuine connection replaying not as evidence of something that was overestimated, but as evidence of something that was real, and that the avoidant, through the accumulated choices of the deactivating process, helped to destroy. The word destroy is not too strong, and this is where the breaking deepens from the initial fracture into something more comprehensive. Because the avoidant who arrives at retrospective clarity is not just grieving a loss, they are grieving their own agency in the loss, grieving the specific moments where a different choice was available, where staying present was possible, where the fear could have been named rather than acted on, where the super empath's outstretched hand could have been taken rather than managed at a careful distance, and was not taken, was not made, was sacrificed to the fear that has been running the relational life for as long as the relational life has existed. That grief, the grief of one's own unchosen choices, of the fear that chose on behalf of the self without the self's full conscious participation, is among the most difficult forms of grief that exists, because it has nowhere external to direct itself. The super empath did not fail. The relationship did not fail from incompatibility. The loss cannot be attributed to circumstance or timing, or the inevitable entropy of connections that simply run their course. It can only be attributed inward, to the pattern, to the architecture, to the decisions made by a defended nervous system that was always trying to protect something, and ended up instead destroying the most valuable thing it had been offered. Sitting with that attribution, not collapsing into self-punishment, which is just another form of avoidance, but genuinely holding the accountability of it, is the most psychologically demanding thing the avoidant has ever been asked to do. And it is asked not by anyone external. It is asked by the silence the super empath left, by the failure of the substitution, by the retrospective clarity that keeps replaying moments where love was offered and fear answered instead. What does the avoidant do with this? Because the breaking is not itself an answer. It is a condition, a state of having been cracked open without any guarantee of what fills the crack, or whether the filling produces growth or simply more sophisticated protection. The avoidant at this juncture is genuinely at a fork, not a dramatic visible fork, an interior one, made of the quality of attention they bring to what they are experiencing, and the willingness or unwillingness to let that experience mean something that changes their trajectory. One path from the breaking is what could be called defensive reconstruction. The architecture, having been fractured, is rebuilt, this time with the fracture incorporated as a load-bearing element of a new, slightly updated story. The story now includes the acknowledgement that the super impact was special, that the loss was real, that something significant occurred. But it incorporates this acknowledgement in a way that ultimately reinforces rather than dismantles the fundamental structure. The avoidant becomes the person who loved someone extraordinary and lost them, a narrative that carries a certain painful dignity and that can be held without requiring the deeper confrontation with what the pattern actually is and what it has actually cost across the full arc of the relational life. This path is the more common one. It is the path of least psychological resistance because it allows the avoidant to register the significance of the loss without fully registering the significance of their own role in producing it. It preserves enough of the self-image to remain functional, and it ensures, with the reliable efficiency of a pattern that has never been genuinely interrupted, that the next significant connection will likely end the same way. The other path is rarer, and it requires something that the breaking, by itself, does not supply. It requires the avoidant to find, in the aftermath of the loss, a quality of support that can hold them through the genuine dismantling of the architecture, not just the fracture, the dismantling, the slow, painstaking, frequently terrifying work of going into the original wound, the place where the child learned that closeness was unsafe, that needing was dangerous, that the self was most protected when it was most self-contained, and beginning to revise it, not intellectually, not through the construction of a new cognitive framework that describes the wound accurately while leaving it structurally intact, but experientially, through the accumulation of new relational experiences, often beginning in therapy, where the conditions of safety and attunement that the super empathetic embodied are replicated in a professional container designed specifically to hold the exposure that those conditions make possible. The avoidant who takes this path does not take it smoothly. They take it with retreats and resistances, and moments of genuine progress followed by the reflexive reassertion of old patterns that make the progress feel illusory, even when it isn't. They take it slowly, on a timeline that is frustrating to everyone involved, including themselves. They take it imperfectly, maintaining aspects of the avoidant architecture long after other aspects have genuinely shifted, in the uneven, non-linear way that all genuine psychological change actually moves. But they take it, and the taking of it is itself a form of honoring what the super empath represented, not as a romantic gesture towards someone who is no longer present, but as the belated, hard-won acknowledgement that the super empath was right, that the connection was worth the exposure it required, that the fear was never as accurate a guide as the avoidance nervous system had always insisted it was. Here is what the super empath needs to understand from the position they now occupy, which is outside the relationship, outside the dynamic, in the process of their own recovery from the particular exhaustion of having loved someone so defended so fully for so long. The breaking that their leaving produced is real. The avoidant is genuinely structurally disrupted in a way that previous losses never produced. The super empath's attunement, which was so precisely calibrated to the avoidant's actual interior rather than their presented surface, means that the loss carries a weight that is proportional to the depth of the seeing. They were seen, perhaps for the first time in their life, genuinely seen. Not just the surface management, but the fear underneath it, the wound beneath the fear, the person beneath the wound, and the person who did the seeing has left. And the avoidant is now living in the acute, unprecedented experience of being unseen again after having known what being seen felt like. That is not a small thing to have given someone. It is, in fact, an enormous thing, a potentially life-altering thing, regardless of whether the avoidance response to the loss takes the path of genuine transformation or the path of defensive reconstruction. The super empath cracked something open in this person that may never fully close again. The question of what the avoidant does with the opening is theirs to answer on their own timeline, in their own interior. But the opening itself, the super empath made that, through the quality of their presence and the depth of their loving and the specific extraordinary patience with which they held the avoidance defended places. They made the opening, and that contribution, invisible and unacknowledged as it may remain, is woven permanently into the fabric of who this avoidant is and who they might yet become. The super empath's own recovery from this dynamic deserves the same honest attention that has been given to the avoidance breaking, because the super empath did not emerge from this unaffected. Their particular form of emotional intelligence, the attunement, the capacity to feel another person's interior with such precision, does not switch off because the relationship has ended. It continues to operate. It continues to feel the avoidance absence in the specific detailed way it felt their presence. It continues to process the loss at the depth it processes everything, which is deeper than most people go, and therefore more costly than most people pay. The super empath may find themselves grieving not just the relationship, but the version of the avoidant that existed in the moments of genuine arrival. The person who surfaced briefly and beautifully and with evident relief in the moments when the fear stepped back far enough to allow actual presence. That person was real. The super empath knows this with a certainty that runs deeper than argument. And grieving someone real, someone who existed, who was felt, who mattered, is the full grief, not the complicated half grief of wondering whether the connection was ever genuine. It was genuine. The super empath's attunement is not wrong about this. What it was insufficient to overcome, by itself, from the outside without the avoidant's own interior participation, the depth of the architecture it was trying to reach through. And that insufficiency is not a failure of the super empath's love. It is the simple structural reality that no amount of external attunement can substitute for the internal work that only the avoidant themselves can do. What the super empath carries forward is something that is easy to underestimate in the immediate aftermath, but that becomes clearer with distance. They carry the knowledge of their own extraordinary capacity, the proof, lived and tested across the full duration of this dynamic, that they are capable of loving someone at the deepest possible level, at the level of the wound, not just the surface, without losing themselves entirely. They made it out, intact enough to write the ending on their own terms, rather than the avoidance, present enough to their own needs to eventually recognize and act on the threshold, rather than remaining past it indefinitely in service of someone else's becoming. That is not a small thing either. That is, in fact, the thing that most distinguishes the super empath from the people in the avoidant's previous relational history. Not just the depth of the loving, the quality of the leaving, the fact that when they went from wholeness rather than from depletion, from clarity rather than from despair, from the quiet authority of someone who knows their own worth well enough to stop offering it to someone who hasn't yet developed the capacity to fully receive it. Both of them, now, the avoidant standing in the silence of the breaking, and the super empath moving through their own recovery with the particular combination of grief and hard-won clarity that this dynamic produces, are at genuine thresholds. Different thresholds, requiring different things, moving at different speeds toward different destinations, but thresholds nonetheless. Places where what has been left behind is finished in a way that makes the next thing possible, even when the next thing is not yet visible. For the avoidant, the threshold is the choice between reconstruction and genuine transformation, between incorporating the loss into a slightly updated version of the same story, or allowing the loss to crack the story open entirely and beginning, with whatever courage can be summoned, the work of writing something new from the foundation up. For the super empath, the threshold is the permission to stop reaching towards someone who is still in the middle of their own breaking, to stop holding space for a transformation that may or may not come, and that either way is no longer their responsibility to facilitate, to turn the extraordinary quality of their attunement, which has been directed outward, toward the defended interior of someone who kept partially refusing it, back toward themselves, toward their own interior, toward the places in them that were quietly set aside during the long, devoted, genuinely heroic work of loving someone who was always fighting the love while needing it most. The super empathy deserves that turning inward, deserves the full application of their own extraordinary attunement to the task of understanding and honoring their own interior with the same precision and compassion they extended so generously outward, deserves, finally, to be the recipient of the quality of love they are so capable of giving, beginning with giving it to themselves, and eventually, when the time is right and the person is genuinely available, extending it outward again towards someone whose capacity finally matches their own. That person exists, not as consolation, not as the reward at the end of a difficult story, but as the simple, statistical, psychologically grounded reality, that extraordinary capacity for genuine connection, when it is combined with the clear-eyed discernment that this experience has produced, eventually finds its equivalent. Not the avoidance potential, someone's actuality. Someone who is already, right now, the person the avoidant might someday become, present, open, undefended enough to receive what the super empath offers without the machinery of fear turning it away at the door. That is what waits on the other side of this, for both of them, in their different ways, on their different timelines, through their different doors. The breaking was real. What it opens into is realer still.